Hello, students. For this lecture, we're going to discuss spending and services. What exactly does our state legislature spend money on? This is a copy of the 2018-2019 Texas state budget, and we see state appropriations, how much the state spent. Overall, if you look here in the middle, we see that the state spent almost $217 billion. That's with a B. That amounts to $7,781 spent for every Texas resident. 106.7 in general revenue spending. We're going to talk about where does money come from. We'll talk about that later. State taxes, federal grants, allocations, payments, reimbursements, the process. But what I want to look at over here is what areas do we go. If you see education when taken as a whole, when we combine public education and higher education, education is what we spend the most money on. 2018-2019 budget $59.9 billion. 2016-2017 budget $58.4. So that went up a little bit. But you see higher education $20.5, grand total $80 billion. Second, Medicaid $62.4, transportation is $26.6, teacher retirement system $5.2, behavioral health $4.0 billion, then border security $0.8 billion. So you can see that after education, we spend, after education, after Medicaid, transportation is our third highest expenditure, but there's a great drop-off between 2 and 3. There's a great drop-off between transportation 3 and teacher retirement system 4. Stated we spent most of our money on schools, on education, so let's start off talking about education. In the early 1800s, the idea of public education is proposed and accepted in northern states. The idea behind this is that for a republic, for a democracy to work, we have to have educated citizens. We have to have educated people. So the North says, yes, we want to open public schools. We will educate them so that the students can become productive members of society. They can participate in politics. How come the South wasn't so accepting of this? Well, realize that the South, we're still an agrarian society. We're still an agricultural society. We have kids, but we need them for labor. They don't need to be going to school. We have more important uses for them. Now, after the Civil War ends, the post-Civil War, we see that the South, we say we begin to accept the idea of public schools, but not really. Up north, keep in mind, post-Civil War South begin to accept public schools. Please keep in mind that early constitutions said that children needed to attend school. However, so 1865, 1866, we see this idea that kids need to start to attend school. But remember, we talked about the Constitution of 1876, and that stripped out this provision. So 1876, school is once again a voluntary issue. Parents can decide whether to send their children to school, to public school or not. In 1915, this is when we see Texas really embrace public education, and by this we passed a compulsory attendance law. What does compulsory attendance mean? When you were little, when you were young and you went to school, why did you go to school? Did you want to go to school? Most of us didn't, but we went because we had to. Compulsory attendance means that the children between the ages of 6 and 18 must attend school. In 1918, we talked about this early on in the semester. This was that first progressive movement. In 1918, the state took a very big step with regards to education. This step was simply passing a constitutional amendment that provided free textbooks for students. Why was this such a big deal? A couple of reasons. As college students, what should you realize about textbooks? They're expensive. Exactly. Do you need them? Some classes, yes. Some classes, no. But they are helpful. Go back to the time frame, 1918, early 1900s. We are still an agrarian society, an agricultural-based society. You know, if we make a couple of bucks a week, that's a lot of money. And if we had 3 or 4 kids and we had to buy their books, could we afford it? No. In 1949, we passed the Gilmer-Aiken Law. This establishes the TEA, the Texas Education Agency. The TEA is created to help administer public education. We see that TEA has grown in power and responsibility over the years. Originally, the public school system was underfinanced, and it was the responsibility of local government to finance education. However, since those early days, we have seen the education system become a partnership between state and local government thanks to the TEA, thanks to the Texas Education Agency. Today, the Texas Education Agency administers 29% of all state education expenditures. The TEA will then help local school districts educate approximately 90% of Texas students. Approximately 90% of Texas students attend public schools. TEA is the liaison, the middleman between school districts, the State Board of Education, and the federal government / Department of Education. They help exist to promote federal and state guidelines. So the TEA is extremely important in our educational system. In 1984, we begin to see the second progressive movement that we also discussed earlier. 1984, statewide accountability standards are established. These standards are applied to both students and teachers. In regards to the student, this policy became known as the no pass, no play rule. Simply put, all you had to do, if you wanted to participate in extracurricular activities, you had to pass all of your courses. Is this still in effect today? Yeah, it is. So, over about 35 years later, we still have this idea that school is a place to learn and it's not a place to have fun. So, no pass, no play. Remember that second prong, that second accountability, was about the teachers. We have the no pass, no teach. We created a content exam that teachers needed to prove that they had a base knowledge. They needed to have a borderline knowledge that they could teach their content. They could teach their course. What happened if the teachers didn't pass this content exam? They couldn't get their teaching license. I said it's still in effect today. Went into effect in '84. As of the 2017-2018 year, we see that students, we have almost 5.4 million students that this no pass, no play applies to. Today we have approximately 359,000 teachers that this applies to. School administration. The Texas Public School Administration has three basic aspects. First, there is substantial local control, but it's local control in a joint state-local partnership. So yes, we do work with the state, but we see that the local school boards, this kind of thing, they have a lot of control. They have a number of choices that they can make. The second aspect, there's an emphasis on professional administration, supervised by laypersons. Finally, the third one, there's independence from the general structure of government. Now, how would we achieve these aspects? How would we do this? We see different ways. First thing is something called the State Board of Education. The State Board of Education has 15 members. They are elected to a 4-year overlapping term. This means that every 2 years, we have half of the members up for re-election. It may be 7, it may be 8, but they are up for re-election. The State Board of Education's purpose, it was to establish general rules and guidelines for the TEA. So, how would this, creating the State Board of Education, how would this apply to the first aspect? Substantial local control and a joint state-local partnership. Well, this applies because we elect members from local districts to school boards, these school ISDs. Each district elects their representatives. Excuse me, hold. I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm sorry I got ahead of myself. State Board of Education, I just told you the wrong information. I was looking ahead. Substantial local control and a joint state-local partnership. This applies because the 15 members are elected from local districts. So we, the people from the local districts, are electing that State Board of Education representative. Now, that's the first aspect. 2 and 3 go together, and this is where I should have started talking about the ISDs. I apologize. How do we achieve independence from the general structure of government? I mean, the legislature makes laws, but in regards to education, they don't implement them. So, who is responsible for implementing educational laws? That aspect is left up to all of the independent school districts in Texas. So we're talking about the independent school districts. The public schools are not administered under one umbrella school district. There is not one big ISD that oversees all the schools in Texas. We, the state, we have the largest number of independent school districts in the country. Do you have any idea how many school districts we have in Texas? I mean, just take a guess. As of 2018, there were 1,200 public and open enrollment charter schools in the state. So it is these school districts that are the basic structure for local control. The ISD boards, the Independent School District Boards. Voters will elect the school board, and these boards will have 7 to 9 members. It depends on the size, the population of the school district. These members will be elected from single-member districts and will be from at-large positions. At-large means that you represent the entire district. They are elected to a 3 to 4 year term depending on the board. They will do various things, like they will set the district's tax rate. They can determine school policies within the guidelines established by the TEA. One of the aspects I mentioned was, professional control, or how do I phrase it? Emphasis on professional administration supervised by laypersons. And this school board is another example of that. What I mean by this is school boards hire a superintendent to run the school districts, to try to implement policy, make sure the school districts are high achieving. These are what we would consider the professional positions, because almost all of these school superintendents have an advanced degree, usually a doctorate of some sort in regards to education. So this is our professional administration. Now, supervised by lay people, who is in charge of hiring the superintendent? Who is in charge of overseeing their job? Well, it's the school board. This is the lay people. And what do I mean by lay people? Do you have to have any special education, any special training to be a school board member? No, you don't. You are just a common everyday person. But you get to supervise a professional administration. So this is how we cover all 3 of those aspects. Politics of public education. State Board of Education. As we have discussed, the State Board of Education has a very important role in Texas education. First thing we're going to look at is their role in curriculum decisions and textbooks. So, one of the State Board of Education's most important roles concerning public education is deciding what education should be, is deciding what should be taught. Curriculum, what should be taught, is determined by the State Board of Education, and the State Board of Education also is responsible for deciding which textbooks can be used in the classroom, which textbooks are acceptable. The State Board, though, it can also be a hindrance to education. In 2010, we see that the State Board created an uproar when it mandated the teaching of conservative values and beliefs, and a conservative view of history. This included downplaying the role of slavery in the Civil War, the positive influence of Joseph McCarthy. This was the senator who instigated the Red Scare during the 1950s, known as McCarthyism. They wanted an increased discussion of the Judeo-Christian influence on the Founding Fathers, and they wanted the kids taught that separation of church and state is not in the American Constitution. Now remember, why is this so important? The State Board of Education's decisions are affecting what all public school systems or school students will learn. They get to dictate what will be taught. Now, textbooks. We see that the State Board of Education has the power to dictate within reason what texts are being used, what textbooks are being used. The State Board of Education provides a list of textbooks that the state may buy for public school courses. So we give this list 3 or 4 books that we find acceptable for Texas history, Texas government, American history, whatever the subject is. We give this list to the TEA. The TEA passes this list on down to the school boards and say, okay, there's 4 books on this list for Texas government or for Texas history. You can select one of the 4 to use as your textbook. So they have a very big influence on textbooks. Culture wars, standardized exams. I'm going to put these two together. Texas, we have taken standardized tests since the 1980s. TOS, TAKS, STAR, EOC. The names change, but the goal is still the same. What is the biggest issue? Well, what is the biggest claimed issue of these standardized exams? What do people say is the worst problem? It's bias. People say that the standardized exams are biased towards minorities, towards poor students. How can a standardized test be biased? Remember, these tests are supposed to measure all students' knowledge. And knowledge, this is supposed to be fairly standardized across the state. A few years ago, as an example of bias, of perceived bias, a few years ago, one of our state senators got up in front of the Senate and was discussing the bias that we find in the standardized exams. And she used a question from the science exam to prove that bias exists in this course. Now, the question off the science exam was, an icicle will melt at what temperature? Ice melts at what? Or ice forms at what temperature? If it gets down below 32 degrees, water freezes, we have ice. If it's 32 or above, it thaws. So 32 degrees, below 32 degrees is freezing. This is a scientific fact. How would this question be biased? According to her, this question shows bias because poor Hispanic kids in South Texas have probably never seen an icicle. So by asking them what about the physical feature and not focusing, well, what she's doing is she's discussing the physical feature and not discussing the aspect of the question. But to her, this is a biased question because these kids may have never seen an icicle. Faculties and students. The State Board of Education certification establishes standards for teachers, but hiring of teachers is left to local school districts. What we do see is that salaries for Texas teachers remain below the national average. The number of students in Texas is increasing. In 2017, 2018, did I say the number of teachers and the number of students? The number of students in Texas is increasing, just in case I said it incorrectly. In 2017-2018 school year, statewide enrollment increased from the previous year by 0.8%. Over the last 10-year period, we have seen total enrollment increase by 15.6%, or 728,189 students. Further, the student body is becoming increasingly diverse. Across the 5 largest racial or ethnic groups in 2017-2018, enrollment increased from the previous year for African Americans, Asians, Hispanics, and the multiracial students. We did see a slight decrease for Anglo students. If we look across these same groups, Hispanic students account for the largest percent of total enrollment in Texas public schools in 2017-2018, 52.4%, followed by Anglo at 27.9%, African American 12.6%, Asian 4.4%, and multiracial students make up 2.3%. Funding and school finance reform. The 2017-2018 budgeted financial data showed that expenditures for public schools on average were $10,532 per student. Now, to understand what's going on, this funding, we have to realize public school funding comes from 3 sources. It's going to come from federal government, going to come from state government, and local taxes is the third area that these school districts, that our education system gets their money from. This funding is governed by a distribution. It's governed by a complex set of rules about how much how the money is set up. I'll get there in a second. We do see that federal grants have increased in recent years, so the federal government is spending more money on education. We have something called the Permanent School Fund. This provides funding from revenue provided by public lands. We see that 1/4 of the motor fuels tax, what's left over, goes to the available school fund for textbooks. The Foundation School Program provides the largest segment of funding from the general funds. Local funding is going to come from ad valorem taxes and property taxes. So I understand that this is hard to follow and everything, but just understand education funds come from numerous sources. How does Texas rank? Nationally, we rank 36th out of 50 states in spending per student. Now, local funding, I'm sorry, I hit the wrong thing. Let's go back. Local funding is based on property taxes, and property tax amount varies greatly across the state. There is such a wide disparity that the state has been forced to impose recapture requirements. This was the Edgewood versus Kirby court case. The Robin Hood plan that we discussed earlier is states or properties will pay in the same amount in property tax to the school districts. Property taxes are all properties are assessed the same, but some districts are property rich. They have property that is worth more. Some properties, property poor, their property value is worth less. So what happens is this money, there is a set figure, there's a median amount of money that is collected. This money is to be distributed to all ISDs, to all school districts. Well, what happens if your school district is what is considered a rich school district, and your property taxes generate more money than what the median is and than what the average is, how much you should get? Well, then the rich school district is forced to cut a check to the state. The state takes this excess money, and it is a redistribution of wealth. It gives this money to the poor school districts to bring them up. So it lowers the amount that the rich school districts can keep, and it raises the amount that the poor districts get, so that each district is getting the same amount of money. Higher education. Colleges. Higher education is coordinated by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. So it's governed by some extent to the THECB, Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. See, the issue with higher education is that it was established haphazardly, piecemeal. It was not created. All of the higher education schools, all of the colleges, were not created at the same time. So we see that the coordinating board has difficulty imposing a rational, coherent system upon the operations of all the schools. If we're talking about these colleges, these places of higher education, we need to talk about the boards of regent and trustees. These outline the role of each public college, of each university. What I mean by this, each college or university's boards sets policies for their own institutions as long as they are within the guidelines established by the coordinating board. Community colleges are also governed by the coordinating board and locally elected boards of regents. Higher education has proven to correlate with higher income, yet the call for greater faculty and student accountability continues. We see that legislative bodies and boards of regents and trustees continue their critical evaluations of higher education and its results. I've just got some charts here you can look at dealing with student enrollment. If you look over here, enrollment by race or ethnicity, it's broken down. 36.8% is Hispanic, 35.5% is Anglo, 13.4% is African American, 14.3% is other. Females, ladies, more y'all are going to school than men are. 56.8% of college students are women, 43.2% are men. So these are just some of the numbers, and here you can see our historical increase in 2-year and 4-year institutions starting in 2000. So these numbers are just kind of fun to look at. We can see that education is is growing. Universities statewide, these public institutions, talking 37. Community colleges, there's 50 districts with multiple campuses. We have the health-related institutions, the technical college system, all this kind of things. But total in Texas, we see there's 148 different types of educational institutions in Texas that are considered higher education. If we're talking a public school system in Texas, UT, A&M, the Texas State University system, U of H, the Texas Tech system. Single campus institutions are going to be our smaller institutions. It's going to be Prairie View, TSU, Sam Houston, the one out in Nacogdoches, Stephen F. Austin, some of these. Once again, breakdowns. The politics of higher education. Financial issues. Students, education, cheap or expensive? It's expensive. Most of y'all are going to a junior college. It's a smart way to do it. You're making the right choice because it is so much less. It is so much cheaper than going to a 4-year. What we see in the early 2000s, the state legislature stopped funding higher education at a high level. However, the legislature told colleges and universities across the state that they could increase tuition to make up for the shortfall. So what they did was something called they deregulated. The state said, we're not paying as much. You are going to be allowed to charge more money than you have in the past to make up the shortcoming. Did the institutions start to charge more money? Yes, they did. Have they stopped? No, because now that they see we're willing to pay more, the state puts in less money and the school charges us more, so we as students have no choice but to pay the going rate. This means that the price of attending college has skyrocketed. What we're seeing is we are actually pricing most people out of the market. We are pricing out the poor, the low and middle income students. They can no longer afford to attend college. Faculty issues. Faculty salaries are below the national average, so we make less money, and we are subject to evaluations if the state believes we are not doing a good job, if we are not meeting the standards set by the state. We are subject to punishment. Is harsh, but might be apt. Retention difficulties. It's going to go with faculty issues and salary. We see instructors that leave the teaching field for the private sector due to higher salaries. Good professors are leaving, and thus the students suffer as they lose quality instructors. Diversity. The state of Texas has decided that diversity is very important in a college education. Diversity, this is not just meeting or working with different cultures. It's really getting to know them. The hope is that you will learn to see things from a different perspective. It will show you the other sides of issues. Quality. Now, I've said there's some issues here. There are. Is the higher education quality in Texas bad? No. As of May 2018, Texas ranks 45th in two-year graduation rates, 33rd in four-year college graduation rates, so not horrible for 4-year. 39th in educational attainment, that's the number of college degrees held. 13th in low debt at graduation, so school in Texas, regardless of issues, is relatively cheap. We rank 21st in tuition and fees. We are actually seeing schools try to put a cap on how much they charge. All of these numbers come from the U.S. News higher education rankings. They did a study. There's issues, there's good things, but I do want you to know that Texas, we consistently have 2 schools that rank in the top 50 in the United States. Can you tell me what those 2 schools are? UT, A&M. So it's not all bad. Health and Human Services. Health and Human Services is the second most costly category of state spending. Remember that we put education together, public education and higher education together, to get education as the most expensive part of the Texas budget. Health and Human Services, HSS, is second. The second most costly category. This category encompasses aid for the poor, as well as Medicaid and a variety of other programs. This includes the Department of Health Services. This provides a variety of services for the indigent, for the uninsured. DHS, Department of Health Services, operates the county clinics, the hospitals that we see around the cities, the states. If you're in the Houston area, we're talking LBJ Hospital, Ben Taub, Casa de Amigos, etc. What we see is that county hospitals and clinics are legally obligated to provide medical care of indigents and uninsured, and when these people use these county services as their primary care facilities, the cost of services increase. Funding. 2018-2019 state budget allocated $62.4 billion for health and human services. This accounts for about 29% of the state budget. What we see is that this money, these funds, come from a mixture of federal grants, allocations, payments, reimbursements. Healthcare dominates federal grants to state and local governments. In 1980, healthcare received only 17.2% of these grants, but this share rose to 43.7% by 2000 and 60% by 2016. This increase has been driven largely by rising costs of Medicaid, which accounts for more than 50% of all federal health care spending. Health programs. We're going to talk about socialized medicine. What we see is that healthcare presents the most serious challenge to policymakers because of the rising cost of providing better services to more people. Among publicly funded health care programs, the federal Medicare program, the state-administered Medicaid program have become increasingly costly, and private health insurance is becoming more problematic for many Texans. So everybody's facing higher funds or higher needs, more money. We see that the state budget, Texas spends almost 1/3 of its state budget on the Medicaid program. This is going to help the poor, the downtrodden, the older, children. If we're talking about federal funds, remember I stated earlier that the school, the educational system gets their money from federal funds, from state funds, and from local taxes. Health programs, the socialized medicine is the same way. Most of the money that Texas spends on these health programs comes from federal funding. In fiscal year 2016, Texas ranked 43rd among states in federal funds per resident. We received $1,493. This was well below the national average of $1,871. But healthcare does dominate federal grants to state and local government. So most of the money the federal government gives to states is for healthcare. In 1980, healthcare received only 17.2% of these grants. But this share rose to 43.7% by 2000 and 60% by 2016. This increase has been driven largely by rising cost of Medicaid, which accounts for more than 90% of all federal health care spending. Medicaid alone received more funding than any other single program. This was $24 billion in fiscal year 2016, according to the State Legislative Budget Board. Or, it received more than half of all federal funding for health and human services in Texas. Still under this socialized medicine, we see that there are 3 types of state health care. There are 3 ways that the state can be involved. Remember, socialized health care, we're talking that the state is involved in some way, shape, or form. The state has something to do with it. The first, the state is the direct provider. This means that the state is paying for everything. So an example of this would be state-run county hospitals, state-run county clinics, something where the state is providing all of the funding. The state is the direct provider of this health care. The second, state is the payer, but not the provider. This means that the state pays employees health benefits, or this would be an example. The state pays the employees health benefits. So it purchases the insurance for their employee, but the employee is free to go to a private doctor. The state does not also provide the medical care. The last, the state is the regulator and buyer of private insurance. What this means is that the state dictates what is included in the health policy and then purchases them, resells these policies to citizens at a reduced price. So the state will go to these health insurance companies, say, these are the items we want covered. They will make a deal. The insurance company will say, okay, this is how much it will cost for your policy to cover this. This is how much it will cost per policy. The state says, okay, they pay it. They then turn around and sell it to those who are indigent, those who can't afford to pay full cost health. So they sell it to them at a discount. So examples of these: Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program. These are example of state as the regulator and buyer of private insurance. Income support programs. These income support programs are temporary measures. They're just means to tide you over between problems, between issues. Let's talk about unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance is funded by a tax on employers, and it is administered by the Texas Workforce Commission in a state/federal partnership. It is designed as income replacement for those who have lost their jobs due to layoffs. Most of the time, layoffs are the cause and thus eligible for what we call unemployment, this unemployment insurance. So that means if you quit your job, are you eligible for unemployment? In very certain, very strict instances, you could be. But, 99% of the time, no, you're not going to be eligible. If you were fired for a cause, are you eligible for unemployment? No, you have to be laid off. For the biennial 2019 year, 84.8% of total appropriated funds for unemployment came from federal funds. 10.2% came from the General Revenue Fund. The amount that you make in unemployment insurance, well, it depends on the amount that you were making before being laid off. TANF, Temporary Aid for Needy Families. TANF is designed to benefit children, these are 18 years and younger, whose parents cannot provide for their basic needs. TANF dramatically declined after the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. Block grants such as TANF have relatively few strings attached, meaning states have broad latitude in how to use this money. But remember, Texas, we're a low tax, low service state. We don't like to provide very much money. TANF, does it help? Kind of. But how much? Honestly, not a lot. The maximum a family of 4 with one parent can receive monthly is $354. A family of 4 with 2 parents can receive a maximum of $363. Is that really a lot of money? No, that's not going to help. But that's what we do. While they are receiving TANF, these same families cannot earn more than $226 for the family of 4 with one parent, or $231 for the family of 4 with 2 parents per month, respectively. Now, the TANF program, this Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, this was designed to provide a hand up rather than a hand out. We're trying to help you out, but we're also trying to encourage individuals to find employment and eventually cease the need for TANF benefits. In an effort to encourage individuals to find employment to better themselves, we limit TANF benefits. Now, this sounds really, really odd. TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. It has lifetime benefits. If I ask you, what is your definition of a lifetime benefit? Most of us would say, well, it's a benefit that we can receive, or that we receive, for the rest of our life. When we get old enough to draw Social Security, that is something we will continue to receive as long as we're alive. It's a lifetime benefit. Well, for Texas and TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, lifetime benefits is a little different. In Texas, our definition of lifetime benefits is the number of years you can receive TANF in your lifetime. So TANF, the lifetime benefits is 5 years. You can receive TANF benefits for no more than 5 years of your entire life. Then on top of that, you can only receive it for 2 consecutive years. What does that mean? It means for year 1 and year 2 you receive benefits. You take year 3 off, year 4, year 5 you can receive benefits. You take year 6 off, year 7 you can receive benefits. But that is your 5th year receiving TANF benefits. You have just met your lifetime benefits. You cannot receive benefits again in your lifetime. The politics of welfare, myths and realities. Welfare, negative connotation. This refers to programs designed specifically to help the poor. Eligibility. There is this erroneous, there is this mistaken belief that all low-income persons are eligible for welfare, though actually only 5% are eligible for TANF, and there is no general program of cash assistance for able-bodied adults without children. They have food stamps and Medicaid available, but these are available to people below the poverty line. Now, one of the biggest issues we have, or we see, one of the biggest issues we have is who is actually eligible. And the argument is that we have a number of immigrants coming over to the United States illegally and participating in our social programs, in our welfare programs. For most programs, you have to be a citizen of the United States. There's a couple of them out there you don't have to be, but by far and away these welfare programs, if you want to call them that, these social programs are open only to citizens of the United States. Public assistance programs alleviate rather than cure. Understand, alleviate is temporary, cure is permanent. Critics argue that welfare programs merely alleviate. They temporarily solve the issue rather than cure whatever the problem is. We are providing public assistance, but it's a temporary fix. There is no If we provide public assistance, there is no encouragement for the recipients to make themselves better, to get off these programs, to get education, to get a job, to find a permanent cure to their solution. So there's this argument that these programs, they don't help. They alleviate, but they don't cure the issue. Resentment occurs. Resentment occurs because people erroneously believe anyone can receive welfare and that their tax dollars are going towards helping people not work. These are the myths, and thus the resentment felt is actually out of not having all the facts on how welfare functions. As previously noted, not everyone is eligible for welfare. It is difficult to determine cheating. Does cheating occur? Yes, there are people out there who scam the system, but there are few and far between. Every once in a while, you'll hear about someone that has defrauded or abused the system, or a doctor overcharging Medicare or Medicaid. However, it actually does not happen as often as we believe that it does. The last one, transportation. Remember, most of the money spent on education, followed by health and human services. Third one was transportation, was highway programs. Here we're talking about Texas Department of Transportation. DOT, Department of Transportation, Texas DOT. Most time we just refer to it as TX, TX dot. So TxDOT. They provide funding for primary and secondary roads. It supervises maintenance of Texas's 80,000-mile road system. We saw something called the Trans-Texas Corridor. It was a proposed superhighway across Texas. It was going to run from Oklahoma down to Mexico. But this was scuttled by opposition from property rights, conservatives, nativists, people who didn't want to see the government step in. What about mass transit? Just a real quick. Generally, Texas remains unreceptive to mass transit systems. Funding. Funding for TxDOT, funding for the highways, is a state-federal partnership. Financial constraints have recently forced Texas to investigate privatization of highways. So some, not toll roads, but hiring companies to build and maintain roadways, but charging people to use these roadways. Remember, in the 2018-2019 budget, transportation received $26.6 billion. And, you know, we get a lot of money for education. We get a lot of money from the federal government for education, a lot of money from the federal government for health and human services. 60% of all money going to those two categories comes from the federal government. 40% comes from the state. For TxDOT, for highways, that's reversed. Only 40% comes from the federal government and 60% comes from the state. Commission, the supervisory capacity. Who oversees TxDOT? TxDOT is supervised by a 5-member commission. It is appointed by the governor with the consent of the Senate. They are appointed to a 6-year overlapping term. Okay, yeah, I just said all this. Types of roadways, the Texas highway system. Interstate highways, 10,302. Farm to market roads, 40,969,000. Federal interstate highways, 28,459. Here's that 80,000 number, this 80,000 miles I came up with. But note that the figures do not include more than 225,000 miles of city streets, of county roads, which accommodate approximately 1/4 of all traffic. Politics of transportation. Funding. Funding is limited. Told you most of the money comes from the state. Where do we get our money from? That state gas tax. That 20 cents per gallon gas tax. The state gas tax, we pay 20 cents per gallon. This is something called a dedicated fund. Dedicated means by law it must go to a certain area, or it must be spent on a certain thing. Out of this 20-cent gas tax, 15 of the 20 cents, 75%, is dedicated to TxDOT. So for every gallon of gas that you buy, for every 20-cent gallon tax that you pay, 15 cents, 75% of it, goes to TxDOT. The rest of their funding is going to come from taxes on lubricants, when you register your vehicle, that kind of thing. Federal funds comes with strings, categorical grants. They dictate to us what the money must be used for. Privatization. Do we want to hire private companies to build these roadways and charge us for the use? I mentioned the Trans-Texas Corridor earlier, just a few seconds ago. It was going to run from Oklahoma down to Mexico. Going to run through the middle of the state. So there was issues. We got really mad because first off, you're going to have to use eminent domain. The state is going to have to purchase this land that already is in private ownership, that's already in private hands. Then we're going to basically turn around and lease out this land to somebody else, let them build a roadway on it, charge us to build this roadway. And what was the purpose of a company, of a private business? To make money. So they're going to charge us on land that we paid for. They're going to charge us to use it. No, privatization of highways is not an option. Politics of state spending. Log rolling. Log rolling is a trading of votes. You vote for my bill today, I will vote for your bill next week. Dedicated funds, I just stated. Dedicated funds by law must go to a specific area. They must go to a specific use. Discretionary funds. Discretionary funds means that the legislature can use this money for whatever it wants to, for whatever it needs. Now, do you think that the state legislature has more money in dedicated funds, or do they have more money in discretionary funds? They have more money in dedicated funds. Yes, the state legislature has a lot of money, but due to most of it being dedicated funds, they are limited to what they can spend this money on. Biannual legislative sessions. This makes spendings more difficult. The budget has to be for 2 years, and thus we are predicting how much we will need for all the agencies over a 2-year period. If we are incorrect, if we don't provide enough money, these agencies cannot be successful. Mass transit. Metro in Houston, I believe it's Dart up around Dallas. We're talking rails, we're talking buses. Texans, like most Americans, we remain unreceptive to mass transit as an alternative to individual motor vehicles. What we see is that on a daily basis, only 4 to 6% of Texas residents regularly commute by urban mass transit. So less than 10% use these mass transit opportunities. Why? A, we like car vehicles. It's a lot more convenient. We can go where we need to go, when we need to go. We don't have to deal with anybody else. But also, just think of the size of Texas. Mass transportation, it's going to somewhat work in the urban areas, the highly populated areas, but do we have mass transit to get you from one small country town to another? Do we have mass transit that's going to run 50 miles? No, we don't. Therefore, mass transit, as wonderful as it sounds, less than 10% of Texans use it. It does not really help.